Brady Street, Whitechapel, London County Council Fire Brigade, 2:14 in the morning, November 1932. Sub-Officer William Kennett, 43 years old, 18 years in the Whitechapel Division, was reading the building from the Dennis motor pump before he ordered his crew off the appliance. Not the fire. The building. The smoke was coming from the first floor front room window on the left. The window glass had not yet blown, which told him something. The smoke was moving slowly at the top of the window frame, grey and dense, pressing rather than billowing, which told him something else. The house was a mid-terrace, 4 properties each side of it, all sharing the same roof line. The street was 22 feet wide at the narrowest point between the curb and the house frontage. He had run hose down Brady Street before. He knew where the hydrant was. He knew the specific dimensions of the first floor front room in this terrace type because he had been inside 6 of them in this street and the 4 streets adjacent to it. What he did not yet know was which side of the party wall the fire was on. This was the question that the next 4 minutes would answer. And it was not a question the Dennis appliance, or the hose reel, or the wheeled escape ladder had come to Brady Street to address for him. The appliance had come to pump water, the ladder had come to reach the window. What Kennett knew about this specific terrace type, about what a coal fire in a first-floor front room of this construction did in its first 30 to 40 minutes, and about where the party walls sat at ceiling height relative to the attic space above it. That was not on the appliance. That was in 18 years on this ground. The family was already on the pavement. 3 of them, a woman and 2 children, in nightclothes, standing on wet cobblestones under the gas lamp at the corner. The woman had a coat over her nightgown. The children did not. They were watching the first floor window. The window was beginning to show colour behind the smoke. The neighbour who had broken the alarm box glass at the corner was still standing at the iron pillar with his hand on it. He had run from his bedroom window to the box. He did not know how long it had taken him. Kennett did not ask. He ordered the crew off the appliance. What was the smoke from that first-floor window at Brady Street telling Sub-Officer Kennett in the 60 seconds before the crew dismounted? And what had 18 years on the Whitechapel ground given him that the brigade's training school at Southwark had not been required to teach? What the training school at Southwark had taught Sub-Officer Kennett: the properties of fire, the behaviour of smoke in enclosed spaces, the principles of pump operation and hose management, the construction characteristics of different building types in general terms. What 18 years on the Whitechapel ground had given him was specific. Not how fire behaved in terraced housing in general, but how fire behaved in the terraced housing stock between Brady Street and Commercial Road. The specific 1890s construction, the specific ceiling heights, the specific attic clearance above the party wall that was not standard across all Victorian terraces, but was characteristic of this builder's run of properties in this part of Whitechapel. The Dennis motor pump that Kennett's crew had brought to Brady Street was operated by the London County Council Fire Brigade as a standard first-line appliance on the Whitechapel ground. The appliance carried a rear-mounted pump capable of delivering, from a charged street hydrant, sufficient pressure to reach a first-floor room through a single hose reel. Period specifications for comparable LCCLFB Dennis motor pumps of this era document a working output in the range of 250 to 300 gallons per minute when running from a properly charged main. This was sufficient for a first-floor front room fire in a property of this size, if the crew had a line on the seat within 5 to 6 minutes of the pump being established. What the appliance could not tell Kennett was whether the seat was still in the first-floor front room. The alarm that had brought the Dennis to Brady Street at 2:14 in the morning had been transmitted electrically from the cast-iron street fire alarm box at the junction of Brady Street and Durward Street. The neighbour in the house opposite had seen the orange light behind the first-floor curtain, had crossed the street to the alarm box, had broken the glass and had pulled the handle. The electrical signal had reached Whitechapel Fire Station in seconds. The station bell had rung. The watch had come off their beds in the sleeping quarters and been on the appliance within 90 seconds of the bell. The Dennis had left the station bay and turned toward Brady Street. What the alarm could not tell the crew was when the fire had started. It could only tell them when the neighbour had noticed it. What Kennett knew from 18 years on this ground was that a first-floor front-room coal fire in this terrace type, burning behind intact window glass and producing slow, dense smoke at the frame top, was likely between 30 and 50 minutes old by the time any neighbour noticed it from the street at night. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel documents one specific element of the British Fire Brigade between 1900 and 1980, the appliance, the building, the knowledge that the officer had built from previous attendances, and the community that depended on that knowledge before smoke detectors and sprinklers changed what fire could do before the crew arrived, not spectacle. The documented operational intelligence of a fire brigade that protected communities built from Victorian building stock that burned in specific ways that specific people had learned to read. What 18 years on the Whitechapel ground gave Sub-Officer William Kennett about Victorian terrace construction that no fire brigade training document or appliance specification had ever been required to record. And what happened to that knowledge when the East End clearance schemes of the 1950s replaced the streets he had been entering since 1920. And if you served in the London County Council Fire Brigade or its successor before 1960, or your family did, put it in the comments. Did you attend terrace night calls on the Whitechapel ground or any East End division? What do you remember about that attic party wall? And what did you know about it that was never on any plan at the station? Next, what the London County Council's Fire Brigade knew about the dock shed construction at Bermondsey's riverside wharves, and what a night tide and a ruptured hydrant meant for how far a crew could run hose before the seat was through the roof. Back at the appliance. What did the party wall construction of a Brady Street Victorian terrace tell Sub-Officer Kennett about how quickly the decision about fire spread needed to be made? And what had the attic space above that party wall been doing since the fire had started? Before you can understand what Sub-Officer Kennett was reading from the Dennis appliance at 2:14 in the morning, you need to understand what the Brady Street Victorian terrace was, its specific construction, and what that construction gave fire once it was inside. The terraced housing stock that made up the working-class streets of Whitechapel, Stepney, and the adjacent East End districts had been built in successive campaigns from the 1860s through the 1890s. The basic construction of the type that Kennett attended was 2 stories above a basement with a rear kitchen extension. External walls, stock brick, 9 inches on the party wall between properties. Floors, timber joists spanning the width of the property between the party wall and the front and rear external walls, with lathe and plaster ceilings below. Stairwell, timber throughout, treads, risers, newel post, handrail, and the joists supporting the first floor landing. The stairwell was approximately 4 feet wide at the base and narrowed at the turn. It had no window, no through ventilation. The party wall was 9 inches of solid stock brick from the basement to the first floor ceiling level. Below that ceiling, between properties, the brick held. A fire contained to ground floor or first floor level in one property would not travel laterally through a 9-inch brick party wall while the crew had water on it. Above the first floor ceiling, in the attic space that ran under the shared roofline, the party wall did not always extend. In the standard specifications of this building type, the party wall was required to rise to the full height of the roof and act as a fire barrier. In a significant number of properties of the 1890s East End builders' runs, it did not. The walls stopped short of the roof timbers, leaving a gap between the top of the brick and the underside of the roof structure. Through that gap, smoke and fire moved freely between attic spaces. This was not visible from the street. It was not documented on any plan held at Whitechapel Fire Station. What Kennett knew about the specific builder's run on Brady Street, that the party wall gap was present in 5 of the 6 properties he had attended, he knew from having been in the attic of 5 of those properties. Each attendance had added information that the building plans had not contained and that no training document had been asked to record. What did Sub-Officer Kennett know about the Brady Street attic construction specifically? And what did knowing it tell him about where the adjacent family was at 2:15 in the morning while the fire on the other side of the party wall had been burning for 30 minutes? The alarm at Brady Street had reached Whitechapel Fire Station at 2:11 in the morning. The Dennis had left the station within 90 seconds. By the time Sub-Officer Kennett was reading the building from the appliance at 2:14, the fire had been burning in the first-floor front room for somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. What had the fire been doing in those 30 to 45 minutes before the alarm reached the station? The coal fire in the front room hearth had been the probable ignition, an unguarded hearth, a spark onto the hearthrug, or a coal that had rolled from the grate when the last person in the room had gone to bed. The hearthrug had taken first, then the floorboards, the floor joists above and beside the hearth. Lath and plaster ceilings burn from below when floor joists heat to ignition. First the plaster falls, then the lathe catches, then the joist below the attic floor is on fire. In a first-floor room with a coal grate fire burning for 30 minutes, the ceiling joists above the seat were receiving sufficient radiated heat to begin charring within that window. The street alarm box system that had transmitted the call was the primary mechanism for public fire alarm in Whitechapel in 1932. The London County Council had maintained a network of cast-iron alarm boxes across the East End since 1880. Each box was mounted on an iron pillar at a street corner, connected by an electrical circuit to the nearest fire station. In Whitechapel, by the early 1930s, these circuits had been upgraded to closed-circuit systems. A break in the circuit, caused by the handle being pulled, sent the signal instantly. What the system required from the public was a person who saw the fire, was close enough to a box to reach it, and was awake. At 1:30 in the morning on a November night in a working-class East End terrace street, the population was asleep. The neighbour who had raised the alarm had been woken by the smell of smoke through an open bedroom window. He had gone to the window, seen the orange light behind the curtain in the house opposite, pulled on his trousers and run to the box. He estimated the whole process had taken about 5 minutes from waking. He had been awake for 5 minutes before he decided with certainty that what he was seeing was a fire and not a lamp. Those 5 minutes added to the 30 to 45 minutes the fire had been burning before the smell reached his window. This was what Sub-Officer Kennett was accounting for at 2:14 when he read the smoke at the first-floor window and estimated the fire's age. What did that age 30 to 45 minutes of burning in a first-floor front room tell Kennett about the specific condition of the party wall attic space directly above it? And what did that condition mean for the family sleeping on the other side of a 9-inch brick wall that stopped short of the roof timbers? What the fire's age, 30 to 45 minutes, told Sub-Officer Kennett about the attic. Smoke had been in the attic space for at least 15 to 20 minutes. Whether it had moved laterally through a party wall gap on one or both sides depended on whether the party wall in this specific property stopped short of the roof timbers. He did not know the answer for this property. He knew the answer for 5 adjacent properties in this builder's run. At 2:17, Kennett ordered a man to the ground floor landing ceiling hatch. The attic hatch, a standard feature of this terrace type, typically a simple timber frame in the landing ceiling, gave direct access to the attic space from below. Opening it and observing smoke movement at the hatch took 30 seconds. If smoke was moving toward one of the party walls, being drawn laterally rather than rising vertically, the party wall gap was open and the fire was already in the adjacent attic. This check was not in brigade operational orders for a residential first-floor fire. There was no formal written procedure that directed a crew to check the attic hatch before committing to the first-floor stairwell. What the Whitechapel Watch had developed, from the 1926 attendants 2 streets north, where a crew had committed to a first-floor stairwell, while smoke was already coming from 2 attic sources above the landing, was a local practice. Check the hatch first, then go up. The 1926 attendants had resulted in a firefighter coming out of the stairwell incapacitated from smoke inhalation, not from the fire room above. From the attic smoke that had filled the stairwell head while the crew was on the stairs. The check at Brady Street at 2:17 showed smoke moving steadily toward the left-hand party wall. The fire was in the attic of the left-hand adjacent property. Kennett ordered a firefighter to the adjacent door. The family inside, a man, his wife, and a child of approximately 4 years old, were asleep. The bedroom was on the first floor. The ceiling above their bedroom was between them, and an attic space that had been filling with smoke for approximately 15 minutes. The firefighter at the door woke them. They were on the pavement at 2:19. The 1926 attendants had taught the Whitechapel Watch that the 30-second attic hatch check was not a delay in operations. It was the information on which the operations depended. What the check at Brady Street had given Kennett at 2:17 was the specific intelligence that changed the operational picture from a one-property fire to a two-property fire. And that put a crew at the adjacent door 2 minutes before the ceiling of the bedroom above would have made the same point by coming down. What did Sub-Officer Kennett order when the attic check confirmed the adjacent property was involved? And what did the Brady Street crew face when they finally went through the fire property's front door without breathing apparatus? What the crew at Brady Street faced when they went through the front door without breathing apparatus at 2:20 in the morning? Smoke at ceiling height throughout the ground floor hallway, moving toward the stairwell. The door at the top of the stairs, between the first floor landing and the front room where the fire was seated, had not yet failed. This was what the smoke movement at the window had told Kennett 20 minutes earlier, and it had remained correct. The crew had 4 feet of clear air at floor level in the hallway. They entered in a crouch, with the hose reel running from the pump outside. The proto-oxygen breathing apparatus set had been in use in the London Fire Brigade since 1913. It was carried in the early 1930s on the brigade's emergency tenders, specialist appliances that were called to fires where the atmospheric conditions made interior work without air equipment impossible. The standard pump that had attended Brady Street carried no proto-sets. This was the established operational model in the period before Major Cyril Morris's 1934 reorganisation of the London County Council Fire Brigade introduced 10 enclosed BA pumps, each carrying 3 proto-sets. In November 1932, the first-line appliance that attended a residential terraced house, first-floor fire, did not carry breathing apparatus. What this meant at the stairwell head, the crew could work in the hallway and on the stairs as long as the smoke layer remained above knee height. Once the door at the top of the stairs failed, and once the fire room opened to the stairwell, the smoke would come down the stairs in full volume. A Victorian terraced stairwell with a fire at the top had no cross-ventilation to hold the smoke layer up. It would fill from the top down within 3 to 4 minutes of the door going. The crew at Brady Street reached the first floor landing door at 2:20. They applied water through the door gap before opening it, a standard practice for this type of entry, to reduce the heat buildup in the room and prevent the door opening from producing an air-fed acceleration of the fire. They held the hose at the gap for 90 seconds. Then they opened the door and took the hose in. The seat was at the hearth and at the floor joist to the left of the hearth. The ceiling above the hearth had partially come down, the lathe and plaster fallen, the joists above exposed and charred. The crew applied water to the seat and to the exposed joists. The attic floor above those joists was what they were protecting from below. They had water on the seat within 8 minutes of the pump being established. What had the crew at Brady Street preserved by getting water on the seat inside that 8-minute window? And what was the woman from the fire property still standing on the pavement without as the crew worked above her head? What the adjacent family had already lost by the time they were on the pavement at 2:19? The use of their attic storage, the structural integrity of the joists above their bedroom, and approximately 3 weeks of habitable property while the smoke damage to the ceilings was assessed and the attic timbers were inspected. They were tenants. The house was owned by a private landlord whose agent would come round in the morning. The family had no contents insurance. The items in the attic, the stored clothing, the boxes, the things that a working-class East End family in 1932 kept in the attic because there was no other storage space in a 2-up, 2-down terrace, were not recoverable from any external fund. The fire property family, the woman and 2 children who had been on the pavement since before the appliance arrived, had lost more. The first floor front room was gutted. The floor joists were damaged. The ceiling of the ground floor room below had taken water through. The gas lighting fitting in the first floor room was destroyed. The family's clothing, stored in the wardrobe in the front room, was gone. The man of the household was on a night shift at the docks. These families were not unusual. They were the ordinary working population of the East End terrace streets, renting, uninsured, a single fire away from a combination of temporary displacement and unrecoverable loss. In November 1932, the London County Council had no automatic emergency housing provision for fire-displaced families of this type. The Borough Public Assistance Committee might be approached. A local charitable organisation might assist. There was no guaranteed support. The family from the fire property would need somewhere to sleep before morning. What Sub-Officer Kennett's crew was doing at Brady Street, holding the fire to one property, protecting the adjacent structure, getting the adjacent family out before the ceiling gave, was not simply fire suppression. It was the operational margin between one family losing a room and one family losing their home, and between one property damaged and 3 or 4 properties damaged. In a terrace of 8 properties sharing one roof line, a fire that reached the roof was a fire that could displace 8 families by morning. The woman from the fire property had been standing on the cobblestones for 35 minutes by the time the crew had water on the seat upstairs. She was watching the first floor window. She had not moved from the spot under the gas lamp where she had been standing when Kennett had ordered the crew off the appliance. What did Sub-Officer Kennett order when the man in the attic confirmed the adjacent fire was under control? And what did the street see when the second engine turned the corner into Brady Street at 2:31? What the street saw when the second appliance turned the corner at 2:31, a second Dennis motor pump from the adjacent Bethnal Green ground, called by the telephone at 2:22 when the man in the attic had confirmed fire in the left-hand adjacent attic space, and the party wall gap was open. Before the second appliance had turned the corner, one of the neighbours standing at the end of the street had gone back inside her own house. She lived 3 properties to the right of the fire. She had heard the second engine's bell on Durward Street before it turned. She went in and began moving her front room contents to the back room. This was not panic. It was a specific assessment, made by someone who had watched terrace fires from the street before. A second engine meant the fire had gone beyond one property. In a terrace where the roof line was shared, that meant a possible roof involvement. A roof involvement in this terrace would come toward the right. The second appliance positioned at the hydrant on the Durward Street junction, 70 yards from the first appliance. The combined pump output gave Kennett a second hose line, run up through the adjacent property and into its attic via the hatch, with sufficient pressure to address the fire in the adjacent attic space from above. The first crew maintained the hose on the seat in the first floor front room of the fire property below. 2 hoses, 2 pumps, 2 points of attack. The roof did not become involved. The firefighter in the fire property attic had opened the party wall gap with a raking pole, working the loose brickwork from the underside, and directed the second hose into the gap while it was still open on the adjacent side. The fire in the adjacent attic was reached with water at 2:38. 16 minutes after the attic check at 2:17 had identified the lateral spread. 8 minutes after the second appliance had arrived. At 2:52, Kennett had sufficient information to stand down the second appliance. Fire out at the seat, fire out in the attic of both properties, party wall intact from first floor ceiling upward on the right-hand side, the gap on the left addressed, the right-hand adjacent property, no attic involvement. The 3 properties beyond that, no involvement. The street by 2:55, 2 appliances, 13 neighbours counted by the officer at the second pump, 3 families displaced, cobblestones wet, 1 child still crying from the doorstep, 1 man in a first-floor bedroom 4 houses down who had slept through it entirely. What had the Whitechapel Watch known about Brady Street before they arrived that the second appliance crew from Bethnal Green did not know? And where did that local knowledge live? And what would happen to it the next time the watch changed at Whitechapel Station? What the Whitechapel Watch knew about Brady Street before they arrived at 2:14 in the morning. 2 specific things that were not on any official brigade document, and 1 thing that was. The thing that was, the hydrant position at the Durward Street junction was recorded in the hydrant ledger maintained at Whitechapel Fire Station, a standard station record listing hydrant positions, depths, and cover types across the division's ground. The first thing that was not. The hydrant cover at the Durward Street junction had been buried under road repair spoil by a gas company contractor in the autumn of 1928. The Whitechapel crew, attending a Brady Street fire in 1928, had lost 4 minutes locating and clearing the cover before the pump could be established. After that attendance, the leading hand on each watch had added the buried hydrant to their own oral pre-shift check. A walk of the critical hydrant covers within the first 3 streets of the station. Both watches. Since 1928. Not in any brigade document. In the knowledge of the crew. The second thing that was not, the attic hatch procedure. The 1926 attendance, 2 streets north, the one where a firefighter had come out of a smoke-filled stairwell, incapacitated because the attic smoke from 2 adjacent sources had filled the stairwell head while the crew was on the stairs, had produced a local practice across both Whitechapel watches. Check the hatch before committing to the stairwell. Both watches. Since 1926. Not in any brigade document. In the knowledge of the crew. The London County Council Fire Brigade operated a 2-watch system that had been introduced in 1920. The 2 watches, blue and red, rotated through Whitechapel Station on alternating shifts. Each watch knew what the other knew because the knowledge had been passed between them at handover and at drill since the incidents that had produced it. The buried hydrant knowledge had been current for 4 years by November 1932. The attic hatch procedure had been current for 6. What the Bethnal Green crew, who had arrived with the second appliance at 2:31, did not know: the buried hydrant, the attic hatch procedure, and the specific party wall configuration of the 1890s builder's run on Brady Street and its adjacent streets. This was not a failure of the Bethnal Green crew. It was the character of divisional knowledge in this era. Locally built, locally held, not systematically shared between adjacent grounds. What happened to the buried hydrant knowledge and the attic hatch procedure? They were current for as long as the watches that held them remained on the Whitechapel ground. When firefighters retired, transferred, or the watch composition changed, the knowledge either transferred verbally or began to erode. What happened to the body of knowledge that the Whitechapel watch had built about the Brady Street terrace stock, the attic hatch procedure, the party wall gap pattern, the buried hydrant, when the terrace stock itself began to change? What happened to the attic hatch procedure, the buried hydrant knowledge, and the party wall gap pattern when the Brady Street terrace stock began to change? It became operationally redundant, in the specific sense that the buildings it addressed were no longer there. The process was not sudden. The slum clearance programs that the London County Council had been developing since the 1930s accelerated in the post-war period. The Housing Act of 1957 gave local authorities strengthened powers to demolish unfit residential property. In the Stepney area, which included the Brady Street terrace stock and its adjacent streets, comprehensive clearance orders came through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. The 1890s builders' runs, the 9-inch party walls, the open attic spaces, the coal grates and the gas mantle fittings, came down row by row. What replaced them? Council housing blocks, some with concrete stair cores rather than the timber stairwells that had produced the 1926 incapacitation and the attic hatch procedure. Fire-resistant floor construction in the new builds. Premises where the party wall question did not arise in the same form because the floor plates were reinforced concrete, not shared timber joists, spanning between a brick wall that stopped short of the roof. The 1961 Public Health Act introduced revised standards for residential building materials and construction. The street alarm box network, which had been the primary public alarm system at Brady Street in 1932, was removed from service in 1958. The last of the London County Council's boxes went that year, replaced by the 999 telephone system, which had been introduced nationally in 1937 and which by the late 1950s was accessible to the majority of the East End population through public telephone boxes, and by the increasing spread of domestic telephone ownership. The timeline between ignition and alarm, which had been the critical gap that the neighbours' sleeping state and the run to the box had produced at Brady Street in 1932, shortened. Not because the fires started differently, because more people had faster access to a telephone. Sub-Officer William Kennett retired from the London County Council Fire Brigade in 1938 after 18 years on the Whitechapel ground. The Brady Street terrace that he had attended in November 1932 was demolished in 1952 as part of a comprehensive clearance order for the Stepney area. The specific builder's run of properties, whose open attic party wall he had spent 6 attendances establishing, the knowledge that had put the adjacent family on the pavement at 219 instead of beneath a collapsed bedroom ceiling, was gone in a single demolition program. The attic hatch procedure that the watch had developed from the 1926 attendants survived in the memory of the firefighters who had used it on the Whitechapel ground. When the last of them retired from the brigade, it was not recorded. The buildings it had addressed had gone before them. If this channel is going to keep documenting what British firefighters knew about the buildings they entered and what that knowledge cost to acquire, subscribe. There are more appliances, more divisions, more watch systems, more smoke columns read from the cab of a Dennis at 2 in the morning, and more attic party wall gaps learned the wrong way in 1926 that were never written down anywhere, and that kept Brady Street standing in 1932. What 18 years on the Whitechapel ground gave Sub-Officer William Kennett about Victorian terrace construction that no fire brigade training document or appliance specification had ever been required to record? And what happened to that knowledge when the East End clearance schemes of the 1950s replaced the streets he had been entering since 1920? And if you served in the London County Council Fire Brigade or its successor before 1960, or your family did, put it in the comments. Did you attend terrace night calls on the Whitechapel ground or any East End division? What do you remember about that attic party wall? And what did you know about it that was never on any plan at the station? Next, what the London County Council's Fire Brigade knew about the dock shed construction at Bermondsey's riverside wharves, and what a night tide and a ruptured hydrant meant for how far a crew could run hose before the seat was through the roof. The Brady Street terrace was demolished in 1952. What the clearance gave Whitechapel, modern housing, fire-resistant construction in the new builds, a shorter alarm timeline through the spread of telephone access, and, eventually, smoke detection required by building regulations in residential properties. What it removed: the 1890s builders' run of terraced housing whose open attic party wall configuration had been the subject of 6 attendances, 1 watch-developed procedure, and 18 years of divisional knowledge accumulated in the Whitechapel ground. The new housing did not produce the fires that had built that knowledge. It did not need to. That was the point. The knowledge went with Kennett when he retired in 1938. The buildings went when the demolition crews arrived in 1952. Nobody had asked either of them to leave anything behind.